Welcome to the Explainer. Today, we're doing something kind of cool. We are drawing a completely neutral, objective cartographer's map to finally make sense of those complex political buzzwords we hear literally every single day. If you've ever felt totally overwhelmed by the endless labels tossed around in the news, well, you're definitely in the right place. We're going to break down exactly where these concepts came from and how they structurally fit together. Okay, let's dive into this. Here's our structural roadmap. We'll start with why we label beliefs, then cover the origins of left and right, the evolution of ideologies, the skeletons of ideology, and finally, the 5 major ideologies. All right, Section 1, Why We Label Beliefs. Before diving into the history, we really have to ask, why do we constantly box ourselves into these political labels? You know, it can feel super frustrating and limiting to just pick a side. But these ideologies, which are basically just sets of ideas about government and economics, actually solve a massive problem for society. Think of it like a giant coin toss experiment. If you toss a coin just 10 times, the results have high variability, right? It's completely unpredictable, and it's really hard to find any sort of pattern. But if you toss that exact same coin 1,000 times, the results generally start to follow a highly predictable pattern. You can actually understand the overall trends. If society focused solely on highly variable, specific individual beliefs, like those 10 coin tosses, it would lead to incredibly complex policymaking, massive polarization, and totally inefficient resource allocation. So we need those broad categories, the 1,000 coin tosses, to facilitate clear communication and manage the sheer complexity of human views. Moving right along to Section 2, Origins of Left and Right. Now, what's really fascinating here is that our entire concept of left and right isn't just some abstract philosophical idea. These were literally physical coordinates in a room. Back in 1791, during the third year of the French Revolution, delegates met in a semicircular room to try and bring some order to a highly chaotic government. Where they actually chose to sit created the exact ideological terms we still use today. Starting on the extreme right side of the room sat a small group who wanted to restore the authoritarian rule of King Louis XVI. They were labeled reactionary for attempting to literally react against the revolution. Next to them sat the conservatives. These were members of the nobility and clergy who wanted to conserve the existing political viewpoint and the old economic structure. Moving toward the middle of the room, we find the moderates. These were lesser nobility who realized, okay, change is definitely needed, but they wanted to approach it flexibly and deliberately. Alongside them were the liberals, a middle-class group whose economic position had recently improved. They favored a liberal democracy, pretty similar to the newly formed United States. Then, over on the left side of the room were the emerging socialists. They favored seizing formerly private property and converting it for public ends, promoting political equality and social responsibility. Finally, on the extreme left sat the radicals, anarchists and revolutionary socialists who wanted to completely destroy the nation-state concept and change the government structure in a sudden, dramatic, and totally unpredictable manner. And get this exact seating arrangement actually gave us our modern political color associations. During these debates, supporters of the conservative right brought a white flag representing the Bourbon family. In response, the socialists brought a red flag, planting it firmly on the left side of the hall. That historical moment completely cemented white with a conservative right and red with a socialist or a radical left. Which brings us to Section 3, the evolution of ideologies. Before the 18th century, the economy was pretty much just about managing your household's basic needs. You farmed, you learned a trade, and you survived on your own manual labor. But then, James Watt invented the steam engine. Massive industrial looms quickly followed. To feed these machines, the enclosure movement swept across Great Britain, displacing peasants, destroying homes, and forcing people into cities to work for wages. Suddenly, when the factories shut down, workers faced immediate starvation. Hard work was simply no longer enough to survive. This sparked a massive, unprecedented crisis, forcing people to look directly to the government for economic intervention. Out of this intense working-class crisis, formal ideologies began to take shape. To actually forge an ideology, you need 3 specific ingredients. First, the ideas, which usually relate to people, the state, and property. Second, dissemination, spreading these ideas like wildfire through books or speeches. And third, timing and relevance, a precise moment when these ideas perfectly resonate with a highly uncomfortable situation, like the harsh realities of the Industrial Revolution. Let's move to Section 4 and see how this builds. The skeletons of ideology. Every ideology is built on a skeleton made of two main components. The first is what we can call the political bone, which defines the relationship between the people and the state. You essentially have two options here. The conservative option relies on monism, emphasizing strict order over individual rights, basically believing people exist for the state. The liberal option is pluralistic, prioritizing individual rights, believing the state actually exists for the people. The second component is the economic bone, and this one deals strictly with the relationship between property and the state. Who gets to own things, who manages commerce, and who distributes the goods. And this brilliantly illustrates the concept. Think about a 0 to 10 scale of state interference. At a 0, you have absolutely no state interference in the economy whatsoever. Around a 3, you start to see some basic regulation. Move up to a 7, and you have pretty heavy state interference. At a 10, you hit complete state ownership. By mixing that political bone and this economic scale, you basically construct an ideology. And finally, we've arrived at Section 5, the 5 major ideologies. This circular political spectrum really helps orient us. Notice how the left and the right actually curve around and reach toward each other at the bottom? The top half represents flexible, democratic governments, where liberalism and conservatism sit. But as you move down the sides toward the extremes into socialism on the left and reactionary on the right, you enter rigid, authoritarian, and non-democratic territory. At the very bottom, total state control forms a literal bridge between the extreme left, communism, and the extreme right, fascism. So the crucial point is how these 5 specifically break down totally objectively. Liberalism prioritizes individual freedom and democratic governance. Conservatism values tradition and limited government intervention. Moving left, socialism seeks collective ownership to reduce disparity through a planned, yet democratic economy. Farther left, communism envisions a completely state-planned, classless society. And on the extreme right, fascism relies on dictatorial power and strict social hierarchies to serve state and military interests. As we look at these really distinct ideologies, it's worth remembering this foundational quote from John Stuart Mill. A party of order or stability and party of progress or reform are both necessary elements of a healthy state of political life. A healthy society actually requires the friction and the balance between these entirely different worldviews. We've mapped out exactly where these labels came from, the crises that form them, and the structural bones that hold them together. Now, the challenge is yours. How do these historical forces and structural bones shape the political landscape you navigate today? The very next time you hear a political buzzword thrown around, I hope you can plot it exactly on the map. Thanks so much for exploring with me, and keep questioning the world around you.